Treason is not the reason for the season. Episode 2, Declaration of Independence. The Revolutionary War started in 1775, in Lexington and Concord, with what would be later described as the shot heard round the world. Once fighting broke out, the Continental Congress realized they would need allies and formed the Committee of Secret Correspondence, meant to forge alliances with foreign governments, most specifically, the King of France, Louis XVI, because France was big enough to fight the British and might actually take them on. To get assistance from the King of France, the founders realized they would need to show how their revolt against the King of England wasn't just a random rabble of aimless anarchists and libertarian loonies overthrowing monarchies wherever they went. The founders had to somehow show they had a legitimate bone to pick with the King of England but could still be allies with the King of France. They had to explain that they were fighting against bad governance, not monarchy itself. They needed to explain that the King of England had failed to govern and they had to take matters into their own hands. This was one of the reasons that drove the creation of the Declaration of Independence in 1776. It is captured in the opening line. When in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. Declaration of Independence 1776. The Declaration of Independence was, first and foremost, meant to explain that the American Revolution was a legitimate revolt and the colonies were a legitimate government. It is summed up perfectly in its opening line: when people revolt, a decent respect for mankind requires they explain themselves. The Declaration asserts that all men are created equal, then lists irrevocable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It says that people create government to secure these rights. And then it concludes that if the government fails to secure these rights, the people have a legitimate right to throw off such government. The Declaration then lists all the ways in which King George failed to protect these rights for the colonialists. The Declaration of Independence is 1,333 words long. A full 866 words, 2/3 of the entire Declaration, are devoted to listing King George's failings. The Declaration doesn't say monarchy bad, democracy good. It says King George bad. The Declaration doesn't attack monarchy itself because the founders had every intention of asking the King of France for help. The Declaration doesn't say that democracy is the only form of acceptable government. The word democracy and republic doesn't even appear in the Declaration. It says people have rights, and whatever government they're under, no matter the form, it is the job of the government to secure those rights. And if the government fails, and fails to the point of abject despotism, then the people have a legitimate right to throw off the government and install some kind of government that protects those rights. This allowed them to approach the King of France without a manifesto that said "Death to all kings" or something like that. Another purpose of the Declaration was to take reconciliation with England off the table. In 1776, the colonialists were fighting the British, but not everyone wanted a war. A chunk of the population consisted of loyalists, people who wanted to remain under the king. And another chunk of the population just didn't want to rock the boat. Some were calling for reconciliation with England, not independence. The Declaration of Independence was partly to cast the die for independence and remove reconciliation as an option. Nowhere in the Declaration is any mention of any right to bear arms, no inherent right to armed revolt whenever people don't like what their government is doing. The Declaration avoids justifying violence and uses language to avoid suggesting violent solutions. It says the people have a right to throw off a bad government, but it doesn't go into detail of how that looks. Also, the Declaration makes clear that they are taking a public stand. It concludes, and for the support of this Declaration, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. Below this text is the signatures of 57 founders and members of the Continental Congress. They are not anonymous anarchists. 4 months after the Declaration of Independence was signed, Ben Franklin sailed across the Atlantic to ask the King of France to help their cause. Today, many Americans have a fantasy notion of what the Declaration of Independence says, and a fantasy version of what the founders intended with the Declaration. Many people think the Declaration of Independence was a call to replace monarchy with democracy. But it wasn't. The Declaration makes no assertion that one form of government is better than another. The Declaration does not advocate for democracy at all. The Declaration definitely does not condemn monarchy as a form of government because the founders had every intention of going to the King of France to ask for help in their war against the King of England. Militia as terrorism extremists believe that the Declaration of Independence says democracy good. All other governments, evil. These militia as terrorism extremists also believe that a democracy means the government does exactly and only what they want it to do, and if the government does anything they don't like, it is not a democracy and therefore is evil, and worthy of being overthrown. The reality is that the Declaration of Independence was much more a matter of political maneuvering of its day, and not some grand statement about how awesome democracy is. The founders wrote it, knowing full well that their declaration had to find a way to explain their revolt against the King of England without offending the King of France, knowing full well that without the help of the King of France, they would lose the war. Timothy McVeigh was enthralled by the Declaration of Independence, but he was enthralled by what he believed it advocated for, and he ignored what it actually did and did not say. And McVeigh thought the government serving a search warrant for possible illegal weapons was treasonous to his militia as terrorism fantasy interpretation of the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and the Bill of Rights. 4 months after the Declaration of Independence was signed, Ben Franklin sailed across the Atlantic to ask the King of France to help their cause. And Franklin was greeted enthusiastically. King Louis supported the colonists with massive military supplies and money. Initially this support was covert. Gunpowder and ammunition from France kept Washington and his army from getting crushed by the British in the first years of the war. At one point, 90% of the gunpowder being used by Washington's men was from France. By 1778, King Louis XVI formally recognized the United States and the British declared war on France as a result. The founders could not win their war against the British were it not for the King of France, and they knew it from the beginning. The militia as terrorism extremists have a warped sense of history when it comes to the American Revolutionary War. They think a bunch of farmers from militias with muskets overthrew the British Empire. But this ties directly into their fantasy that they could somehow overthrow the American government with one truck bomb at a federal building, or a bunch of farmers with assault rifles, or a bunch of rednecks storming the Capitol building and attacking police officers there. But the reality is that the American Revolutionary War was won because of France's massive military support. The Declaration of Independence was not declaring that anonymous men with anonymous guns could overthrow their government if they didn't like it. The Declaration says King George failed to protect their rights and failed to the point of abject despotism, and therefore they would throw off his rule as illegitimate, while allowing them to ask the King of France for help, all while signing their name to their revolt.